No law enforcement, no medical help, no escape routes. Between 1929 and 1941, over 500 hobo camps operated across America, where desperate men and women gathered near railroad yards seeking work, shelter, and community during the Great Depression. These weren't temporary camping spots. They were permanent settlements where violence, disease, and death were daily realities for people who had nowhere else to go. The most dangerous camps became notorious among hobos as places where survival required constant vigilance and where many who entered were never seen again. They were located in isolated areas where railroad security couldn't patrol regularly, creating lawless zones where the strongest preyed on the weakest without consequence. They attracted the most desperate and dangerous individuals who had been expelled from other camps for violence, theft, or worse crimes. They operated under brutal hierarchies where newcomers faced initiation rituals that could result in serious injury or death. They harbored criminals fleeing justice who used the camps as hideouts while continuing their predatory activities. Every camp had its dangers. Contaminated water sources that caused dysentery and typhoid outbreaks, killing dozens within weeks. Violent gangs that controlled access to food and shelter through intimidation and assault. Fire hazards from improvised heating and cooking that could destroy entire camps and trap sleeping occupants. Exposure to industrial toxins from nearby factories and rail yards that caused permanent health damage or death. The hobos who survived passage through these camps had learned to recognize the warning signs and survival techniques that could mean the difference between making it out alive or becoming another unmarked grave in the woods. Knowledge of which camps to avoid completely and which could be navigated safely with proper precautions. Understanding of the unwritten rules and power structures that govern these dangerous communities, but which specific hobo camps were the most deadly and what made them so dangerous for travelers seeking shelter. What survival techniques could help hobos navigate these camps without becoming victims of violence or disease? Which warning signs indicated camps that should be avoided at all costs? And how did the most dangerous camps develop the reputations that made experienced hobos choose to sleep in the open rather than risk entering these settlements? Today we're exploring the 7 most dangerous hobo camps in American history, places where desperation and lawlessness created conditions more deadly than the wilderness itself. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. 1. Hell's Halfacre, Kansas City, Missouri, the killing fields of the rails. Hell's Halfacre in Kansas City earned its reputation as America's deadliest hobo camp through a combination of extreme violence, contaminated conditions, and complete absence of law enforcement that created a zone where murder was commonplace and survival required constant vigilance. Located in the industrial wasteland between the Missouri Pacific and Santa Fe rail yards, this camp housed 800 to 1,200 desperate individuals in conditions that claimed lives daily. The geographic location placed the camp in a 40-acre area of abandoned warehouses, scrap metal yards, and contaminated industrial sites that provided concealment from railroad security while exposing inhabitants to deadly hazards. The camp was positioned between active rail lines carrying freight trains every 15 to 20 minutes, creating constant noise that masked screams and violence. Access required crossing multiple sets of electrified tracks where dozens died annually from electrocution or being struck by trains. The water contamination came from industrial runoff, sewage overflow, and chemical dumping that created water sources containing lead, mercury, and other toxins at levels 50 to 100 times higher than safe limits. The primary water source was a creek that received direct discharge from a lead smelting plant, causing neurological damage, kidney failure, and death in residents who drank from it regularly. Alternative water sources included stagnant pools contaminated with human waste and industrial chemicals. The violence statistics documented by railroad police and coroners showed 150 to 200 deaths annually in the camp, with causes including murder, assault, poisoning, and accidents that were likely homicides. The camp operated under the control of violent gangs who demanded tribute from all residents and killed those who couldn't pay or challenge their authority. Initiation rituals for new arrivals included beatings that left many permanently disabled or dead. The shelter conditions used abandoned buildings, makeshift shacks, and underground tunnels that created fire traps and structural collapse hazards. Most shelters were constructed from scrap wood, tar paper, and metal sheeting that could ignite instantly and burn completely within minutes. Underground shelters were dug into contaminated soil and frequently collapsed, burying occupants alive. Overcrowding meant 8 to 12 people shared spaces designed for 2 to 3 individuals. The disease outbreaks included typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, and venereal diseases that spread rapidly through the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Medical care was non-existent, and sick individuals were often abandoned or killed to prevent disease spread. Tuberculosis rates were estimated at 40 to 50% of camp residents, with the disease spreading through shared sleeping spaces and contaminated air in enclosed shelters. The criminal activity included organized theft rings, prostitution, drug dealing, and murder-for-hire operations that used the camp as a base for crimes throughout Kansas City. Professional criminals used the camp to recruit desperate individuals for dangerous jobs, often abandoning or killing them after operations were completed. The camp served as a disposal site for murder victims from crimes committed elsewhere in the city. The survival techniques for those forced to enter Hell's Halfacre included traveling in groups of 3 to 4 trusted individuals, avoiding the central camp areas controlled by gangs, and limiting stays to daylight hours when violence was less common. Experienced hobos recommended entering only during shift changes at nearby factories when increased activity provided some protection. Food and water were obtained outside the camp whenever possible to avoid contamination and conflict over resources. 2. The Jungle, Chicago, Illinois, industrial wasteland of death. The Jungle in Chicago's South Side was a sprawling hobo camp covering 200 acres of industrial wasteland where chemical contamination, violent crime, and industrial accidents created a death rate that exceeded many battlefields. Located adjacent to the Union stockyards and multiple chemical plants, this camp housed 2,000 to 3,000 individuals in conditions that combined the worst aspects of industrial pollution with complete lawlessness. The chemical contamination came from decades of industrial dumping that saturated the soil and groundwater with arsenic, lead, mercury, and organic solvents at concentrations that caused immediate health effects and long-term poisoning. The camp was built on former chemical waste disposal sites where barrels of toxic materials had been buried and were now leaking into the environment. Residents developed skin lesions, respiratory problems, and neurological symptoms within weeks of arrival. The air pollution from surrounding factories created a toxic atmosphere that caused respiratory disease, cancer, and immediate poisoning from acute exposure events. The camp was downwind from a coal gasification plant that released hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and other toxic gases during normal operations. Chemical accidents at nearby plants periodically released chlorine gas, sulfur dioxide, and other deadly compounds that killed camp residents without warning. The industrial hazards included active rail lines, chemical storage areas, and heavy machinery that operated 24 hours daily without safety barriers or warning systems. Residents scavenged materials from active industrial sites, leading to frequent accidents involving crushing injuries, chemical burns, and electrocution. The camp was built around active rail switching yards where trains moved constantly, killing 50 to 75 residents annually. The gang violence was organized around control of scavenging territories, with different groups claiming exclusive rights to specific industrial areas and killing trespassers without warning. The most violent gang controlled access to the stockyards where food scraps could be obtained, demanding payment or sexual favors from anyone seeking access. Territorial disputes resulted in pitched battles using improvised weapons, firearms, and industrial chemicals as weapons. The fire hazards were extreme due to the combination of flammable industrial waste, improvised heating systems, and chemical contamination that could ignite spontaneously or explode without warning. Major fires occurred monthly, destroying large sections of the camp and killing dozens of residents who were trapped in underground shelters or overcome by toxic smoke. Chemical fires produced deadly gases that killed people miles downwind from the camp. The disease transmission was accelerated by contaminated water sources, overcrowded conditions, and the presence of diseased livestock from the nearby stockyards. Anthrax, tuberculosis, and various parasitic diseases spread rapidly through the camp population. The contaminated environment prevented wounds from healing properly, leading to widespread infection and gangrene that killed many residents from minor injuries. The law enforcement response was limited to occasional raids that resulted in mass arrests, but no improvement in conditions, as the camp was rebuilt within days of each raid. Police avoided the area except in large groups due to the extreme violence and industrial hazards. Coroners stopped investigating deaths in the camp due to the volume and the dangerous conditions required to recover bodies. 3. Skid Row Jungle, Seattle, Washington, Pacific Northwest, Predator Haven. The Skid Row Jungle in Seattle occupied 150 acres of waterfront industrial area, where the combination of isolation, extreme weather, and predatory criminals created conditions that made it one of the most feared hobo camps on the West Coast. Located between active lumber mills and shipping facilities, this camp attracted the most dangerous individuals expelled from other camps throughout the Pacific Northwest. The geographic isolation placed the camp on a peninsula surrounded by Puget Sound on 3 sides, with the only land access controlled by violent gangs who demanded tribute from anyone entering or leaving. The isolation meant that screams and violence went unheard by outside authorities, and bodies could be easily disposed of in the deep water surrounding the camp. Escape was nearly impossible for those who ran afoul of the camp's criminal hierarchy. The weather extremes included Pacific Northwest storms with 70 to 80 mile-per-hour winds, torrential rain that could last for weeks, and winter temperatures that dropped below freezing while remaining wet. The combination of cold and wet conditions created hypothermia risks that killed dozens annually, while the constant moisture prevented proper shelter construction and promoted disease transmission. Flooding during storm surges could trap residents in low-lying areas. The lumber mill hazards included active sawmill operations with unguarded machinery, chemical wood treatment facilities, and massive log storage areas where shifting timber could crush anyone underneath. Residents scavenged wood and materials from active mill sites, leading to frequent accidents involving saw blades, chemical burns from wood preservatives, and crushing injuries from moving logs. Mill waste created toxic air pollution and contaminated water sources. The criminal hierarchy was controlled by a group of violent predators who had been expelled from camps throughout California, Oregon, and Washington for crimes including murder, rape, and robbery. These individuals used the camp's isolation to continue their criminal activities without interference, preying on new arrivals and weaker residents. The leadership changed frequently through violent power struggles that left multiple bodies in their wake. The initiation violence required new arrivals to submit to beatings, sexual assault, or participation in crimes against other residents as proof of loyalty to the camp leadership. Those who refused initiation were killed or driven into the surrounding wilderness, where they faced death from exposure or drowning. The initiation process was designed to identify potential threats to the leadership and eliminate them before they could organize resistance. The prostitution operations were controlled by the camp leadership, who forced both men and women into sexual slavery, serving clients from the surrounding industrial area and visiting ships. Resistance to participation resulted in severe beatings, mutilation, or death. The prostitution operations spread venereal diseases throughout the camp population and attracted violent clients who often injured or killed the victims. The disposal methods for murder victims included weighing bodies down and dumping them in Puget Sound, feeding them to mill equipment that would destroy evidence, or burying them in the extensive industrial waste areas surrounding the camp. The isolation and industrial activity made body disposal easy and detection nearly impossible. Estimates suggest 200 to 300 people disappeared from the camp annually. 4. Hooverville Hell, Detroit, Michigan, Motor City Murder Ground. Hooverville Hell in Detroit was built in the abandoned Packard automotive plant complex, where the combination of industrial decay, chemical contamination, and extreme violence created a 300-acre death trap that housed 1,500 to 2,000 desperate individuals during the worst years of the Great Depression. The camp's location in the ruins of America's automotive industry created unique hazards that made it one of the deadliest hobo settlements in the Midwest. The structural hazards included partially collapsed factory buildings with unstable floors, walls, and roofs that could collapse without warning, crushing anyone underneath. The multi-story factory buildings had been stripped of valuable materials, leaving dangerous gaps in floors and walls that created fall hazards of 30 to 50 feet. Residents built shelters in these unstable structures, leading to frequent collapses that killed entire families. The chemical contamination came from decades of automotive manufacturing that left the soil and groundwater saturated with lead, mercury, chromium, and organic solvents at concentrations that caused immediate poisoning and long-term health effects. Paint stripping operations had left layers of lead paint chips throughout the complex, causing lead poisoning in residents who inhaled dust or consumed contaminated food and water. The machinery hazards included abandoned automotive equipment, conveyor systems, and hydraulic presses that remained partially operational and could activate unexpectedly, crushing or dismembering anyone who came into contact with them. Scavenging operations to recover valuable metals led to frequent accidents involving heavy machinery, electrical systems, and sharp metal edges that caused severe injuries and deaths. The gang warfare was organized around control of different sections of the massive factory complex, with territorial boundaries marked by violence and maintained through constant intimidation. The most violent gang controlled the main entrance and demanded tribute from all residents, while other gangs fought for control of areas with the best shelter or access to scavenging opportunities. Gang conflicts resulted in pitched battles using firearms, improvised weapons, and industrial equipment. The fire hazards were extreme due to the combination of flammable industrial materials, improvised heating systems, and the maze-like structure of the factory complex that made escape difficult during emergencies. Fires spread rapidly through the interconnected buildings, trapping residents in upper floors or basement areas. The presence of industrial chemicals created toxic smoke that killed people before they could escape the flames. The medical emergencies were common due to the industrial hazards, violence, and contaminated environment, but medical care was non-existent, and evacuation was nearly impossible due to the complex's size and the hostility of residents toward outside authorities. Injured individuals were often abandoned to die or killed to prevent them from attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement or medical personnel. The law enforcement avoidance was complete, with police refusing to enter the complex except in large, heavily armed groups due to the extreme violence and structural hazards. The complex's size and maze-like layout made it easy for criminals to hide and impossible for small groups of officers to patrol safely. Bodies were often discovered weeks or months after death, if they were found at all. 5. Death Valley Junction, Bakersfield, California, desert killing ground. Death Valley Junction near Bakersfield was located in the Mojave Desert, where extreme heat, water scarcity, and isolation created conditions that killed more hobos per capita than any other camp in America. Built around a remote rail junction 50 miles from the nearest town, this camp attracted desperate individuals who often died within days of arrival from dehydration, heat stroke, or violence over scarce resources. The extreme temperatures reached 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months, with ground temperatures exceeding 150 degrees Fahrenheit that could cause severe burns through direct contact. The desert environment provided no natural shade or shelter, forcing residents to construct inadequate shelters from scrap materials that became deadly ovens during peak heat periods. Nighttime temperatures could drop 40 to 50 degrees, creating thermal shock that killed weakened individuals. The water scarcity was the camp's deadliest feature, with the nearest reliable water source located 15 miles away across open desert that was impossible to traverse during daylight hours in summer. The camp's primary water source was a contaminated well that produced 2 to 3 gallons per day of brackish water containing high levels of alkali and other minerals that caused kidney damage and death. Fights over water access resulted in multiple deaths daily during peak summer months. The isolation meant that medical emergencies, violence, or accidents could not be reported to outside authorities, and rescue was impossible for those who became lost or injured in the surrounding desert. The nearest law enforcement was 50 miles away and rarely patrolled the area due to the extreme conditions and lack of roads. Radio communication was impossible due to the remote location and lack of equipment. The shelter inadequacy forced residents to live in structures made from scrap metal, cardboard, and cloth that provided no protection from the extreme temperatures and could become deadly traps during sandstorms or flash floods. Most shelters were built in washes or low areas that provided some protection from wind, but became death traps during the brief but violent desert storms that could produce flash floods with no warning. The violence over resources was extreme due to the scarcity of water, food, and adequate shelter materials that made survival a zero-sum game where one person's survival often meant another's death. The camp operated under brutal survival of the fittest conditions, where the weak were abandoned or killed to conserve resources for the strong. Newcomers were often robbed of their possessions and left to die in the desert. The wildlife hazards included rattlesnakes, scorpions, and other desert predators that were attracted to the camp by food scraps and water sources, leading to frequent venomous bites and stings that were fatal without medical treatment. The camp's location in prime habitat for dangerous desert wildlife meant that residents faced constant threats from creatures that could kill within hours of contact. The disposal of bodies was simplified by the desert environment, where corpses could be dragged a short distance from camp and left to be consumed by scavengers or mummified by the dry heat. The isolation and harsh conditions meant that bodies were rarely discovered by outside authorities, and the camp's population fluctuated wildly as people died and were replaced by new arrivals who were unaware of the camp's deadly reputation. 6. Poison Creek Camp, Gary, Indiana, Industrial Toxic Wasteland. Poison Creek Camp in Gary, Indiana was built in the shadow of massive steel mills, where industrial pollution, toxic waste, and violent crime combined to create a 100-acre death zone that killed residents through poisoning, disease, and violence. Located adjacent to U.S. Steel's Gary Works, the largest steel mill in America, this camp exposed residents to industrial toxins at levels that caused immediate health effects and rapid death. The air pollution from the steel mills created a toxic atmosphere containing sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and heavy metals at concentrations that caused respiratory failure, neurological damage, and death within weeks of exposure. The camp was positioned directly downwind from the mill's main smokestacks, ensuring that residents breathed the most concentrated pollution. Visibility was often reduced to less than 100 feet due to the thick toxic smog. The water contamination came from direct discharge of steel mill waste into Poison Creek, which ran through the center of the camp and served as the primary water source for residents. The creek contained cyanide, phenols, heavy metals, and other industrial chemicals at concentrations that caused immediate poisoning and death. The water was visibly discolored and had a strong chemical odor, but desperate residents had no alternative sources. The soil contamination from decades of industrial waste dumping created ground that was toxic to touch, with lead, mercury, and other heavy metals at concentrations that caused skin lesions, neurological damage, and organ failure. Residents who slept directly on the ground developed severe health problems within days, while those who grew food in the contaminated soil died from acute poisoning. The industrial accidents were frequent due to the camp's proximity to active steel production facilities, with explosions, chemical releases, and equipment failures that killed camp residents without warning. Molten metal spills, gas leaks, and structural collapses at the nearby mills created hazards that extended into the camp area. Residents scavenging materials from the mill sites faced constant risks of burns, crushing injuries, and chemical exposure. The gang control was exercised by groups of violent criminals who had been expelled from other camps for extreme violence and used the camp's toxic environment to eliminate rivals and control resources. The gangs controlled access to the least contaminated areas of the camp and demanded tribute from residents who wanted to avoid the most toxic zones. Gang warfare was conducted using industrial chemicals as weapons, causing horrific deaths. The disease outbreaks were accelerated by the toxic environment that suppressed immune systems and prevented wounds from healing, leading to widespread infection and death from minor injuries. Respiratory diseases were universal among camp residents, while skin diseases and neurological disorders affected nearly everyone within weeks of arrival. Medical care was impossible due to the toxic environment and the hostility of residents. The cleanup attempts by local authorities were abandoned due to the extreme contamination and the violent resistance of camp residents who had nowhere else to go. The camp was eventually declared uninhabitable by health authorities, but residents continued to live there because they had been rejected from all other camps due to their health problems and violent behavior. 7. Nightmare Hollow, Birmingham, Alabama. Southern Hell on Earth. Nightmare Hollow in Birmingham was built in a valley between active coal mines and steel mills, where the combination of mining hazards, industrial pollution, and racial violence created conditions that made it the most feared hobo camp in the South. Located in a 200-acre area of abandoned mine shafts and industrial waste, this camp housed 800 to 1,000 individuals in conditions that combined the worst aspects of industrial contamination with the brutal racial tensions of the Depression-era South. The mining hazards included hundreds of abandoned coal mine shafts that created fall risks of 100 to 300 feet into flooded or gas-filled chambers that meant certain death for anyone who fell in. The mine shafts were often concealed by vegetation or debris, creating hidden death traps throughout the camp area. Methane gas seepage from the mines created explosion risks that could kill dozens without warning. The coal dust contamination covered everything in the camp with a layer of fine particles that caused black lung disease, respiratory failure, and death within months of exposure. The dust was constantly stirred up by wind and activity, creating a choking atmosphere that made breathing difficult and caused permanent lung damage. Residents developed the characteristic black sputum of coal miners within weeks of arrival. The racial violence was extreme due to the camp's location in the segregated South, where white and black hobos were forced to compete for limited resources while maintaining the brutal racial hierarchies of the region. Lynchings, beatings, and other racial violence were common, with camp leadership enforcing segregation through intimidation and murder. Cross burnings and other terrorist activities were used to maintain racial control. The industrial pollution from nearby steel mills and chemical plants created air and water contamination that rivaled the worst industrial disasters in American history. The camp was positioned in a valley that trapped industrial emissions, creating a toxic bowl where residents breathed concentrated pollution 24 hours daily. Chemical accidents at nearby plants periodically released deadly gases that killed camp residents. The mine subsidence caused frequent ground collapses that could swallow entire sections of the camp without warning, burying residents alive in underground caverns or crushing them under tons of debris. The unstable ground made construction of adequate shelter impossible, forcing residents to live in structures that could collapse at any moment. Rescue of buried residents was impossible due to the continued instability. The water contamination came from acid mine drainage that created water sources with pH levels low enough to cause chemical burns and death from consumption. The primary water source was a creek that ran orange with iron oxide and other mining chemicals, but desperate residents had no alternatives. Drinking the water caused immediate stomach problems and long-term organ damage. The law enforcement corruption allowed the camp to operate as a source of cheap labor for local mines and mills, with police and camp leaders cooperating to provide workers who could be worked to death without legal consequences. Residents who tried to leave were often arrested and returned to the camp, while those who complained about conditions were killed or disappeared. These 7 camps represented the absolute worst of hobo life during America's Great Depression. Places where desperation, violence, and industrial contamination combined to create conditions more deadly than war zones. "There's camps where you might get robbed and camps where you might get sick," wrote hobo chronicler Dangerous Dan McGrew in 1934. "But these 7 camps are where you go to die, and everybody knows it, but nobody talks about it, because talking don't change nothing." The survival of anyone who passed through these camps proved that human endurance has limits that most people never imagined they might have to test.